Doing our series on superheroes, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, which is all of us, or can be all of us. Will you pray with me? Loving God, may the words from my mouth and the meditations of our hearts and minds be pleasing to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So today, as we're continuing in this series, we're looking especially at particular gifts and how you can use them. Last week we talked about Jennifer Trevino and the ways in which she's been gifted with an ability to connect with folks with intellectual disabilities. And she also has this incredible enthusiasm and wackiness, and those come together for one amazing week at her camp. And today we're going to be talking about one of our newer members, Sarah Garrett. Sarah, before I say anything else, I have to do this disclaimer. She said, be sure and tell people I don't think that I'm anything that great, that there's no superhero in me. That's not me. My superhero is Jesus Christ, and I'm just trying to be a good instrument for Christ. So, okay, did y'all hear that preface? All right. But when I asked her about her life and using her gifts, she told me about how even as a girl, little girl, she wanted to help people, and she wanted to find ways to give them gifts or be kind to them. This gift of service started really young. But for Sarah, life intervened. She was married. She had kids. She worked a pretty important job as an engineer, and so she was busy with lots of things. But later on in her life, when she married Robert, his generosity and kindness gave her the space and the ability to start using her gift more. They were in Turkey, and they had a housemaid and a houseman there that were married, and they had kids, and they had practically nothing. And so Bob and Sarah put their son through 2 years of computer school, and today he is successful, and he's able to care for his mom because of the foundation that Bob and Sarah gave for him. So all of that kind of started up in their marriage after her kids were raised. She started being able to use that more. But when Bob died, she had to find some way to have meaning in her life, something to do with herself. And she said she just started listening to God, getting still and listening. And one thing she'd kind of always wanted to do was go out and help people that are in the midst of terrible disasters. And so two things happened at the exact same time. She was reading a book about Billy Graham. I think it's called Nearing Home. And he said in there, I am nearing home, meaning that his life is going to be over. He's an older man, and I want to finish well. And she thought, man, I'm nearing home, and I want to finish well too. And then she also found out about Billy Graham Ministries and their work that they do in disasters. So she started doing all kinds of training, and she ended up working as a chaplain. She deployed 5 times. Do we have? Yeah, there we go. We can see 2 tornadoes, 2 floods, and a hurricane. And she found that by working beside more experienced chaplains, she was able to move a little bit out of her comfort zone, seeing how it was done. And she was there with people when they were in such distress, making a huge difference. She was able to develop her need to communicate her faith. It didn't just come easily. I think that's important for us to kind of hold on to. If sometimes it feels weird to talk to someone about your faith, well, even for somebody like Sarah, it was hard. And this is a passion for her. She had to go through training and learn, how do you speak authentically from your heart? How do you speak in a way that people know you've got no agenda, and find a way to connect? So she did a lot of training to develop that. But now, because of some health issues, she's not able to go out on those deployments. But she is still busy. She's working in our room in the inn on Thursday nights it'll be starting again in July. Every Tuesday she goes to Alta Mesa Church of Christ. They serve a meal to people in need, and she loves serving them. She's working with United Methodist Women. There are all kinds of ways that she's serving as she can. And she said, I was so many years in the workforce leading, being the person in charge. She has no desire for that anymore. She doesn't want to be the leader. She wants to be the one who just serves and loves and prays and lets somebody else lead, which is another kind of good lesson. Just because you're good at something at one point in your life doesn't mean that you have to continue doing that. God will steer us in different directions depending on where you are and your circumstances of life. So Sarah's been loving and serving and praying for some time now. All of this, thinking about gifts, got me thinking about Paul and his insistence. If you look through his letters in the New Testament, this one we read from Romans is just one example of many, where he says, everybody's gifted and every gift matters. And that was hugely important for him to say, because whenever you get groups of people together, they tend to do this thing where they figure out who's on top, like their pecking order, who's more valuable than somebody else. And you had these really diverse communities coming together. There would be people who were really rich and slaves. There would be Jews and Gentiles, all these people coming together. And one of the things that kept happening in these churches was this issue of speaking in tongues. So they would be having their meeting and they would be talking about Jesus Christ, and someone would begin to speak in tongues. And oftentimes that was seen as, ooh, you are really in the Spirit. You are more in the Spirit if you do that than other people. And so Paul was constantly having to say, no. Speaking in tongues is a wonderful thing, but other gifts are just as important. And that was hard. So he kept having to say that, partly because it was starting to be disruptive. It's really easy for something like that to become more about ego and less about spirit. So all of those things, it's kind of good to know that even the early church, so close to Jesus, was such a mess. You know, doesn't that give you hope a little bit? It does me. Thinking about you guys, thinking about gifts, I was thinking about the mission trip coming up. My mom and I were talking about all of this, and she and I both decided we have absolutely nothing to offer on a mission trip. I can't cook at all, but certainly I can't cook like for a bunch of people that y'all would actually want to eat. There is no way. And I don't know how to use tools. I'm helpless. Y'all actually go and you build things that are good, that people like you know, their wheelchair can go on a ramp and it not cause a disaster that ends up in the hospital. That would be my ramp. So no one wants me, but they do want you. And so we're using our gifts differently. And my hat is so off to all of you guys. So in thinking about this, these different gifts, and they're different value in a sense, but in God's economy, they are all valued the same. It got me thinking about probably the most classic TED Talk that there is, and it's the one by Sir Ken Robinson. It's called Schools Kill Creativity. I think it's been watched 38 million times. Probably 17 million of those were by me, but because it's really funny. I commend it to you. Sir Ken Robinson, it is one of the most popular ever. But in there, he makes this impassioned case for schools to embrace all different kinds of learning. He says that for so long, schools have only valued a certain kind of thing. And I see that as so true. In his talk, he mentions a young girl whose school, she couldn't sit still, she was kind of disruptive. They thought that she had a learning disorder. And so she ended up going with her parents to a counselor. And the counselor talked with her and observed her, and then got her parents aside and said, "Your child is not sick. She is a dancer." And they said, "Well, what do we do with that?" And he said, "Take her to dance school." And that's what they did. And she was able to thrive. She found her tribe there of people that wanted to get up and move and use their bodies. And she went on to the Royal Ballet in London, and from there worked with Andrew Lloyd Webber. She choreographed Cats and all kinds of major musicals. She gave pleasure to millions of people through her work, and by the way, is a multimillionaire. So, though the thing about it is, if it had just been the school would have diagnosed her with ADHD. You know it's true. This was in the 30s, and they didn't have that yet. They didn't know, but they would have, and she would have been the problem. And she probably wouldn't have been a success because she couldn't do school the limited way that you were supposed to be able to do school. So there's this idea of how do we learn to value all the different gifts? In schools, how do we recognize the different kinds of brilliance in different kinds of kids? Now, in Paul's day, the less valued gifts were things like, I'm trying to think what would have been less valued. I don't know, the quieter things, but clearly speaking in tongues, the people thought that was the boss, that was the thing you needed to do, or certain kinds of leadership was more important. But I wonder in our day what Paul would say. Like, what are the gifts that we're undervaluing? What are the ones we're overvaluing? And I think that we maybe overvalue people who are gifted to test well. Now, Allie, I'm hoping you test like nobody has ever tested, so I'm not putting that down. If you test well, rock on, because now it's really important in school that you be able to do that, but not everybody can. Not everybody tests well. And we put a value more highly on people that are headed to college. But you know what? We need people who are mechanical. We need people who have the gift of being able to do plumbing, all of these things, but we tend to value that less. But actually, let me just tell you, if you have something go wrong with your toilet, you will value it more, at least in that moment. But the way our society is structured, we also tend to value extroverts more highly than introverts. They're the ones that are charismatic and you want on the team. Well, all people are important. In fact, they say, I don't know that they've been officially diagnosed, but Albert Einstein and Bill Gates are both pretty much thought to have Asperger's syndrome. So it shows you that God can use different wiring. But so many times we're labeling that as wrong and pathological and trying to medicate. And please hear me say, I'm not trying to be simplistic about this. I believe that God works through the hands of researchers and doctors and provides medicines that allow people to be their best selves. But I also think that there is sometimes when being a little bit different from the norm is exactly what this world needs. But we haven't learned how to value it as highly. In Lola's class, at her school, there's a little girl who absolutely can't sit still. Now, unlike in the TED Talk, she's not a dancer. What she is a little scientist. She wants to be out looking for creatures. When they go out to recess, she runs to the culvert because there's lots of rocks to look under, and that's what she loves. But because she can't sit still, and because her mind wanders and she doesn't listen always attentively, it would be really easy to just label her as a bad kid, unsuccessful in school, and track her off in a different way. But the teachers have recognized her particular brilliance. And so whenever they're doing science, she's the one that's lifted up. All the kids know that she's amazing with nature, with all of that. Lola, about a month or so, a little more than that, got a leopard gecko. We now have a leopard gecko at our house, Pookie. And Pookie's about this long, and anyway, she's very sweet. And anyway, Lola is supposed to take care of Pookie. So she knew that. So she went to this little girl and said, I got a leopard gecko. How do I take care of her best? What's your advice? And this little girl who'd never had a leopard gecko gave her really solid advice on what you need to do with reptiles and how you proceed. So all the kids know. But I hope that as she continues through school, that her particular brilliance that does not fit inside the box is not squished. That they don't tell her, you're not as good, you're not as smart, because her particular smart in this narrow band. So we have to start thinking about our own gifts differently. A lot of times as women, this probably happens for men too, I've just been a girl all my life, so I don't know about your experience, but we get taught you don't want to toot your own horn, you don't want to say anything positive about yourself because you'll seem like you're arrogant. And so it's really hard, I see, for women to say, I am really compassionate. Immediately they want to preface it and say, oh, but everyone else is too, and I think at least in the privacy of our own minds and in our relationship with God, it's really important to say, God, I think you've given me this gift. If you've got good friends, you're not quite sure what your gifts are, your friends can help you figure that out. But it's got to be the kind of friend who's not trying to just snow you. You know, because there are a lot of friends, oh, you're so gifted in everything you do. And no, you don't want that. You want somebody that will say, okay, here's what I see. And here's some things maybe I don't see. That'll give you that as a gift, that kind of honesty. Because then as you start recognizing it, here's why this is important. We can get steered into the wrong things if we're not aware of what our gifts are. That can happen because somebody says, you're really good at math, and you may be good at it. You may be the kind of student that's good and can do it, but that's not really what's on your heart. That's not your giftedness. I saw this all the time at the fire department. There would be people that came onto the department who had dreamed about being firefighters since they were 2. And they'd had the hats and everything, and this is what they wanted to do. They had a gift of service, that kind of selfless service that our firefighters have. They wanted to be part of a team. They had all of that giftedness. And then their identity became about being firefighters, and it was fulfilling and meaningful and good. But every time there would be a couple of people who tested well, who did great, who got on the department, and they could succeed, but they were only there because their dad had been a firefighter and they were supposed to carry on this legacy. Or they were only there because they were told that you'd be good at this and this is a steady job or something. And those folks ended up miserable because firefighting is sometimes boring. And firefighting is sometimes so hard you can't imagine on every level, physical, mental, everything. And so if they weren't plugged into something that was authentically true about their own gifts, they would end up miserable. And that can happen to anybody. I could call you on the phone and say, oh, would you please be on the finance committee? Now, I know well enough to know if someone ever dared to call me and say that, bless their hearts, I would say, oh, you don't want me on the finance committee. Please no, because I have absolutely no capability with numbers at all. But I know that, right? So I could say, but sometimes you feel like, well, the pastor's asked me or this person's asked me, and I can do it. I think you've heard me say before, give us a holy no. And we might be a little like, oh, I was counting on that because I'm trying to fill my team. But you know what? It would be better for the church if the teams were filled with people who had those gifts. So you have to know, though, or you'll end up on finance when you should be on care committee or whatever. You see what I'm saying? Know what yours are. I'd posted on Facebook an assessment of spiritual gifts that's free and easy to take. I can get you that link again. There are lots of things that help you discover what are your gifts. So keep thinking about that. This week, notice what gives you pleasure, like we talked about last week. What do people identify as good? And know that just because you're good at it doesn't mean that's your gift. There are lots of things that you have to be good at in this world. Your gift is something else. Find what that is. And then, Paul is saying in this text, if you are a teacher, then devote yourself to teaching. If we spread ourselves too thin, we're also going to miss the mark. So if you have a gift of service like Sarah Garrett, then serve. And you don't need to be on all these other things. Devote yourself, because that's the key to the most meaningful life for you. But it's also the key to us being the hands and feet of Christ in the world. We have to know our gifts and move through them and act on them. Are you using your gifts? What are your gifts? We're going to continue exploring this in the next couple of weeks. Will you pray with me? Loving God, we thank you for all of the different ways in which you have given us gifts, placed blessings in our lives, and you've also given us circumstances that hone those gifts. Help us to have clarity about what you would have us do, and help us move in your footsteps as your hands and feet. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.